There comes a moment when the mirror shatters from within, not from violence, but from the sudden absence of the image it once reflected. The empath simply vanishes, not physically at first, but something deeper. Their willingness to be consumed dissolves like salt in water that has forgotten how to taste. What remains is not emptiness, but a presence so complete that it renders all manipulation powerless. This is the silence that terrifies narcissists more than any scream ever could. It is the quiet of someone who has remembered they exist beyond another's need to devour them. The narcissist reaches for the familiar strings that once controlled their puppet, only to find their hands grasping air. The empath has not become cruel. They have become unavailable to cruelty. They have not hardened their heart. They have simply directed its river toward more deserving soil. Carl Jung once wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But what happens when one substance remembers its original nature and refuses the toxic alchemy? What happens when the empath discovers that their greatest gift was never their capacity to absorb poison, but their ability to transform into something unreachable? The narcissist, for the first time, must face the mirror of their own making. And in that reflection dwells only the shadow they spent a lifetime avoiding, naked, undeniable, and hungry for the very soul they have been devouring. She used to believe that love meant absorption, that to care for someone meant to disappear into their needs, their moods, their endless hunger for validation. She fed their emptiness with pieces of her own soul until she became a ghost in her own life. The narcissist does not love, they consume. They do not see the empath as a person, but as a resource, an emotional well from which they can draw indefinitely. The empath becomes their external nervous system, feeling what they cannot feel, processing what they refuse to process. This is the archetypal dance between the devourer and the giver. The narcissist projects their inner child's hunger onto the empath, demanding to be fed, held, reassured, while simultaneously rejecting the very nourishment they desperately need. They want the empath's energy but despise their vulnerability. They crave their compassion but mock their sensitivity. James Hillman spoke of the psychology of projection, how we cast our disowned parts onto others and then relate to those parts through them. The narcissist projects their capacity for genuine feeling onto the empath, then attacks that very feeling as weakness. They make the empath carry their discarded humanity while maintaining the illusion of invulnerability. But every psychological dynamic has its breaking point. The empath's nervous system, flooded with cortisol from years of walking on eggshells, begins to rebel. The body knows what the mind has forgotten, that survival sometimes requires the courage to stop feeding what is devouring you. In the quiet moments between crises, she began to hear a whisper. What if your absence could teach what your presence never could? There is no dramatic announcement, no final confrontation, no list of grievances laid bare. The empath simply stops explaining, stops defending, stops hoping that this time will be different. The decision happens in the body first. The shoulders that once curved inward to make themselves smaller begin to straighten. The voice that once apologized for existing finds a different register, not angry, not pleading, but somehow ancient, certain. This is what Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls the moment when the wild soul reclaims its territory. The domesticated parts of the psyche that learn to shrink, to please, to disappear, suddenly remember their original nature. The empath doesn't become cruel, they become unavailable to cruelty. The narcissist senses this shift like an animal senses an earthquake. Their attempts at manipulation begin to escalate. The silent treatment that once induced panic now meets only silence in return. The rage that once provoked desperate attempts at appeasement now encounters a wall of serene detachment. But why now, the narcissist wonders, their control mechanisms failing one by one? What changed? What changed is that the empath finally understood the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. They realized that their endless giving was not healing the narcissist. It was enabling their refusal to heal. Every time the empath absorbed their pain, they robbed the narcissist of the opportunity to feel it, to learn from it, to grow through it. The departure is not an act of hatred. It is an act of love so fierce that it refuses to participate in mutual destruction. The empath walks away not because they care less, but because they finally care enough about both of their souls to end the dance. In the sudden absence of their primary emotional supply, the narcissist encounters something they have spent their entire life avoiding: themselves. Without the empath's reactions to fuel their sense of importance, without their distress to validate their power, without their endless forgiveness to absolve their cruelty, the narcissist is left with only their own internal landscape. And that landscape is a desert. The grandiose self, that carefully constructed persona that demanded constant admiration, begins to crack without its daily feeding. The internal critic, usually projected onto others, turns inward with devastating precision. The narcissist discovers that the voice that told them they were superior was the same voice that whispered they were worthless. This is what depth psychology calls the return of the shadow. All the parts of themselves that the narcissist deemed unacceptable and cast onto others come flooding back. The neediness they mocked in the empath reveals itself as their own desperate hunger. The weakness they despised becomes their own terror of abandonment. The emotions they branded as pathetic surge through them with overwhelming force. Joseph Campbell wrote about the hero's descent into the underworld, but what about the villain's descent into their own void? The narcissist, stripped of their external sources of validation, must finally confront the wounded child they have been running from their entire life. Some will use this crisis as a catalyst for genuine transformation. They will face their shadow, integrate their disowned parts, and begin the long journey toward authentic selfhood. But others will simply find new sources of supply, new empaths to drain, new mirrors to reflect their false grandeur. The difference lies in whether they can bear to sit with the void long enough to discover what lives beneath it. Behind every narcissist lives a child who was never allowed to be small, vulnerable, or imperfect. This child learned early that their worth depended on their performance, their appearance, their ability to be exceptional. They were praised for their achievements, but never seen for their essence. Or perhaps they were the opposite, chronically neglected, criticized, or abandoned. This child decided that if they could just become important enough, special enough, powerful enough, they would finally receive the love they never got. The grandiose self became a fortress, built around a terrified, lonely child. When the empath leaves, this child is suddenly exposed. Without the constant external validation, the narcissist must confront the original wound that started it all, the moment they learned that their authentic self was not enough. Marion Woodman spoke of the false self as a beautiful mask worn over a face that was never allowed to develop. The narcissist's entire identity is constructed around being seen, admired, needed. But now, in the silence of the empath's absence, they must face the question, who am I when no one is looking? The answer is terrifying. They are the child they have been running from their entire life. The child who was afraid, who needed, who hurt, who was human. The child whose pain was so unbearable that they built an entire false personality to avoid feeling it. This is the narcissist's dark night of the soul, not the romantic spiritual crisis of saints and mystics, but the brutal psychological reckoning of someone whose entire sense of self has been built on a lie. They must choose: continue the charade with a new cast of characters, or finally turn toward the wounded child within and begin the terrifying, transformative work of authentic healing. The narcissist's identity is fundamentally performative. They exist in relation to others' perceptions of them. Without an audience, they begin to lose cohesion, like an actor who has forgotten their lines and suddenly realizes They are standing alone on an empty stage. The empath's gaze was more than attention. It was confirmation of existence. Even negative attention served this function. The empath's pain validated the narcissist's power. Their forgiveness confirmed their specialness. Their endless patience proved their importance. Now, in the deafening silence of indifference, the narcissist discovers something horrifying. They have no idea who they are when no one is watching. This is what Buddhist psychology calls the illusion of the ego, the false belief that we are the roles we play, the masks we wear, the stories we tell about ourselves. The narcissist, more than most, has confused their persona with their essence. They have become so identified with the image they project that they have lost touch with their authentic self. Without the empath's reactions to define them, they must confront the void where their sense of self should be. They realize they have been a character in search of an author, a mirror reflecting nothing but reflections. Some will desperately seek new audiences, new empaths to mesmerize and drain. Others will escalate their behavior, creating drama and chaos just to feel real again. But a rare few will sit with the emptiness long enough to discover what lies beneath the performance. In that silence, in that void, something authentic might finally have space to emerge. For the empath, walking away is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of their return to themselves. But this return is not easy. The empath must grieve not only the relationship, but the version of themselves that believed love meant self-annihilation. The withdrawal is both literal and symbolic, physically removing themselves from the narcissist's presence, energetically reclaiming the parts of their soul they gave away, psychologically learning to inhabit their own emotional landscape without constantly monitoring someone else's. This is what shamanic traditions call a dismemberment, the necessary destruction of who you were so that who you are meant to be can emerge. The empath must allow their people-pleasing self to die, their fawn response to quiet, their habit of making themselves small to dissolve. In the void left by the narcissist's absence, the empath begins to remember what their own voice sounds like. They rediscover preferences they had forgotten, boundaries they had dissolved, dreams they had abandoned. The space that was once filled with chaos becomes a sanctuary for self-discovery. The nervous system, after years of hypervigilance, begins to regulate. The body learns that it is safe to relax, safe to feel, safe to exist without constantly scanning for threats. Sleep deepens, creativity returns, joy becomes possible again. This is not selfish, it is sacred. The empath's healing is not just personal but collective. By refusing to participate in toxic dynamics, they model what healthy love looks like. By choosing themselves, they give permission for others to do the same. The empath discovers that their greatest gift was never their capacity to absorb others' pain. It was their ability to feel deeply, love authentically, and maintain compassion even in the face of cruelty. These gifts don't disappear when they set boundaries. They become more powerful, more discerning, more transformative. Science now confirms what ancient wisdom traditions have always known. The body holds the score. The empath's nervous system, subjected to years of emotional terrorism, carries the imprint of every silent scream, every swallowed rage, every suppressed truth. The polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, reveals how chronic relational trauma dysregulates our autonomic nervous system. The empath's body exists in a constant state of threat detection, flooded with stress hormones, unable to access the social engagement system that allows for genuine connection and joy. When the empath finally leaves, their nervous system begins the slow journey back to regulation. The hypervigilance that kept them scanning for the narcissist's mood shifts, gradually softens. The fawn response that made them perpetually available to others' needs begins to quiet. The body remembers what safety feels like. This is where spirituality and neuroscience converge. The empath's healing is simultaneously biological and mystical. As their nervous system regulates, their intuition sharpens. As their stress hormones decrease, their connection to something larger than themselves deepens. As they reclaim their energy, they discover it was never meant to be given away. It was meant to be cultivated, honored, and shared from a place of fullness rather than depletion. The empath learns to trust their body's wisdom, the tight chest that signals a boundary violation, the pit in the stomach that warns of deception, the expansion that comes with authentic connection. The body becomes their guide back to wholeness. This somatic awakening is deeply spiritual. The empath realizes that their sensitivity is not a weakness to be overcome, but a gift to be treasured. They are not too much. They are exactly what the world needs. Someone who can feel deeply, love fiercely, and maintain their integrity even when it costs them everything. Carl Jung wrote that the shadow is not the darkness in us, but what we have not yet brought to light. For the narcissist, the empath served as both a repository for their disowned darkness and a screen for their projected light. Without this external container, the narcissist must finally contain their own contradictions. The shadow that returns is not pretty. It contains all the vulnerability they branded as weakness, all the need they labeled as pathetic, all the fear they disguised as superiority. Without the empath to carry these disowned parts, the narcissist is flooded by the very emotions they spent their life running from. This is the psychological equivalent of a pressure cooker suddenly losing its valve. Decades of suppressed feeling explode into consciousness all at once. The narcissist may experience panic attacks, depression, rage, or a devastating sense of emptiness. They are being forced to feel everything they convinced themselves they were above feeling. Some will interpret this crisis as evidence that the empath was the problem. If only they would return, the pain would stop. They will blame the empath for their suffering, making them responsible for both causing and curing their psychic distress. This is the shadow's last attempt to avoid integration, but others will recognize this crisis as an opportunity. They will understand that the pain is not punishment, but information. It is their psyche's attempt to communicate what has been ignored, denied, or projected for decades. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the gatekeeper to wholeness. Integration of the shadow requires the narcissist to develop what they have always lacked: genuine self-compassion. They must learn to hold their own pain with the same tenderness they demanded from the empath. They must become their own source of comfort, validation, and love. This is the most difficult journey a narcissist can undertake, the journey from grandiosity to humanity, from superiority to authenticity, from needing to be special to accepting that they are enough just as they are. There is a sacred geometry to absence. The space where the empath used to be becomes a teacher more powerful than any presence ever was. This void does not lecture or preach. It simply exists, unavailable to manipulation, untouchable by charm, unmoved by rage. The narcissist discovers that silence has its own language. It speaks of boundaries that cannot be crossed, of dignity that cannot be purchased, of love that refuses to enable its own destruction. The empath's absence becomes a mirror that reflects not what the narcissist wants to see, but what they need to see. In mystical traditions, the void is not empty but pregnant with infinite possibility. It is the fertile darkness from which all creation emerges. The narcissist, thrust into this primordial space, has the opportunity to create themselves anew, not as a reaction to others' needs or expectations, but from their own authentic center. But this requires them to sit with the discomfort of not knowing who they are, to resist the urge to fill the void with new sources of supply, to trust that something genuine can emerge from the dissolution of their false self. The empath's silence becomes a spiritual practice for the narcissist, an enforced meditation on the consequences of emotional violence. Every attempt to provoke a response that meets only emptiness becomes a lesson in cause and effect. Every manipulation that finds no target becomes a mirror reflecting their own desperation. This is not cruelty, it is compassion of the highest order. The empath's absence creates the spaciousness the narcissist needs to finally meet themselves. It removes the distractions, the external dramas, the elaborate defenses that have kept them from the encounter with their own soul. Some will flee from this void, seeking new empaths to fill it. But those who stay, who sit with the silence, who allow themselves to be taught by absence, may discover something miraculous, their own capacity for genuine love, starting with themselves. The empath's journey away from the narcissist is not just psychological recovery, it is a spiritual pilgrimage back to their own sacred territory. They must reclaim not only their boundaries but their birthright, the right to exist without justification, to feel without apology, to love without losing themselves. This healing happens in layers, like an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures buried beneath years of debris. First comes the rage, the fury at being used, discarded, gaslit, and blamed. This anger is sacred. It is the force that finally said, enough. The empath must learn to honor their anger instead of spiritually bypassing it. Beneath the anger lies the grief for the relationship that never was, for the love that was never real, for the time that was lost, for the innocence that was shattered. This grief is not self-pity, it is the natural response to profound loss. The empath must allow themselves to mourn fully before they can be reborn. Under the grief lives the shame, the voice that whispers they should have known better, left sooner, been stronger. This shame is not theirs to carry. It belongs to the system that taught them to confuse self-sacrifice with love. The empath must learn to return this shame to its rightful owner. At the deepest level lies the original wound, the childhood experience that taught them their needs didn't matter, their feelings were too much, their very existence was a burden to others. This is the wound that made them available to narcissistic abuse in the first place. Healing this wound is the key to never being vulnerable to such exploitation again. The empath learns to parent themselves with the tenderness they were never shown. They speak to their inner child with the compassion they gave so freely to others. They create the safety they always craved by becoming their own sanctuary. As they heal, they discover that their empathy is not a weakness, but a superpower. When it is grounded in strong boundaries and authentic self-love, they learn to feel others' pain without absorbing it, to offer compassion without losing themselves, to love without self-abandonment. In the end, the empath's departure serves both souls, though in radically different ways. For the empath, it is liberation, the return to their own inner authority, the reclamation of their stolen power, the beginning of a love affair with their own life. For the narcissist, it is revelation, the stripping away of illusion, the confrontation with truth, the opportunity for genuine transformation. The narcissist stands before the broken mirror of their own making, finally forced to see what their cruelty has cost them. Not just the empath's love, but their own capacity to receive it. Not just the relationship, but their own soul. They realize perhaps for the first time that their greatest enemy was never the empath. It was their own refusal to feel, to be vulnerable, to be human. Some narcissists will use this crisis as a catalyst for deep, authentic change. They will enter therapy, do the shadow work, learn to love themselves with the same fierce tenderness they once demanded from others. They will discover that vulnerability is not weakness but courage, that needing others is not pathetic but human, that their worth is not dependent on their performance but inherent in their being. Others will learn nothing. They will blame the empath for their pain, seek revenge for their abandonment, or simply find new sources of supply to drain. They will remain prisoners of their own grandiosity, trapped in a world of mirrors that reflect only their own emptiness. But for the empath, the outcome of the narcissist's journey is no longer their responsibility. They have learned the most difficult lesson of all. You cannot love someone into wholeness. You cannot fix someone who refuses to acknowledge they are broken and you cannot save someone from the consequences of their own choices. The empath's greatest gift to the narcissist is not their presence, but their absence. It is the silence that forces self-reflection, the void that demands self-confrontation, the boundary that finally says, "Your healing is your responsibility, not mine." In walking away, the empath becomes a teacher of the highest order. They demonstrate that love without self-respect is not love at all, that compassion without boundaries is enablement, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone's self-destruction. The moment the empath walks away, both souls stand at a crossroads. One path leads to authentic healing and genuine love. The other leads to more of the same suffering, played out with new actors, but the same tired script. The choice, as always, is theirs to make. But the empath's work is done. They have returned to themselves, reclaimed their power, and remembered their truth. They are not here to be consumed by others' darkness, but to shine their light from a place of wholeness and strength. In the end, the empath's departure is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of two very different books, one titled Recovery, the other Awakening. The narcissist will write whichever one they choose, but the empath will write only their own, and it will be a love story between them and their reclaimed soul. There is a silence that breaks mirrors, a void that teaches what presence never could. Some souls must die to remember they were never truly alive. This script weaves together depth psychology, spiritual wisdom, and practical understanding to create a transformative viewing experience that honors both the empath's journey to freedom and the narcissist's opportunity for authentic change.